Parkinson's cases have more than doubled in 30 years. 87% of people who get it have absolutely no genetic explanation, none. Living within 1 mile of a golf course could more than double your risk. And there's a weed killer out there that the EPA's own website says 1 sip can kill. It's banned in over 70 countries, including China. But its use in America doubled between 2013 and 2018. I think this is not bad luck. This is not aging. It could be something we did. Today's guest has spent his entire career proving it. Dr. Ray Dorsey is a neurologist, one of the world's leading Parkinson's researchers, a White House champion for change, and the author of The Parkinson's Plan. Amazing book, by the way. His argument is really simple and terrifying. Parkinson's is a man-made disease, and because we made it, we can stop it. If you don't know me, I'm Neal K. Shah. I'm a Johns Hopkins and NIH-funded caregiving researcher and a caregiver myself. Dr. Dorsey, so glad you're here. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, Neal. Everyone calls me Ray. Delighted to be with you.
So Ray, yeah, let's get into it. So I had some great questions here around, around Parkinson's, kind of what's going on, and would love to hear your take. But the history of it was fascinating. I thought, that in 1817, Dr. Parkinson described 6 people with the disease, and today over 10 million people have it. You've said it can't be genetics, it can't be aging. So what do you think is going on, and why is this growing so fast? I've read it's the fastest growing neurological disorder in America.
Yeah, and so many of your audience know this disease intimately because they're caring for someone with Parkinson's disease. Over 1.2 million Americans have the disease, or they've had a friend or family member recently diagnosed, and thanks to you and your efforts to reduce that burden for people caring with neurodegenerative diseases. In the words of Michael J. Fox, Parkinson's disease sucks, and it hasn't always been around. For the vast majority of humanity, Parkinson's disease was likely rare, if not extraordinarily rare. When Dr. Parkinson described the condition in 1817, he described 6 people with the disease, and he said, "I'm describing a disease that's not been classified in the medical literature." It wasn't in the medical textbooks of the time. And he goes to great lengths to describe that other features of the disease, like tremor, have long since been described, but this constellation of tremor, slowness of movement, stooped posture, tendency to walk forward and fall forward was something new. 200 years later, it's estimated that 6 million people had the disease. Today, nearly 12 million, as you suggested. So how do you go from 6 to 6 million in the span of just 200 years? So we know what portion is genetics. There's a great study led by the Parkinson's Foundation called PD Generation, and offers free genetic counseling and genetic testing to anyone with Parkinson's disease. It's still ongoing. And in 2024, they published the results from the first 8,000 individuals who participated in this study. And they looked at these 8,000 individuals. Of these 8,000 individuals, largely Americans, 13% carried a genetic cause or genetic risk factor for the disease. As you said in your opening, that means 87% of Americans with Parkinson's do not carry any known genetic cause or genetic risk factor for the disease. The second explanation that many people say is, there's just a lot more aging and there's more older people. And indeed, that's the case. But Parkinson's is growing far faster than other age-related diseases. For example, it's growing far faster than Alzheimer's disease, which we know is also linked to aging. And aging doesn't cause Parkinson's disease, nor does aging likely cause Alzheimer's disease. You put a mouse in the laboratory and you let it age, it will never spontaneously develop Parkinson's disease or Alzheimer's. The only way that mouse develops Parkinson's or Alzheimer's is if you manipulate its genes or expose it to toxic chemicals. Parkinson's disease, dementia are not natural consequences of aging. They are unnatural consequences of aging. They are not inevitable, they're preventable. And in our book and in others, we outline a way that we can prevent people from ever suffering from this terrible disease. And I think not only is this true for Parkinson's, but we know from the Lancet Commission that 45% of Alzheimer's disease may be preventable. And Alzheimer's, as you and your listeners know, have a far greater genetic component to it, mainly changes in ApoE4, than are present in Parkinson's disease. So Parkinson's is not a natural consequence of aging. It's largely a man-made disease, and we can take actions to create a world without Parkinson's disease, just like the vast majority of human history has been largely free of this disease. We can make it free again.
Oh, thank you so much. That's, I think, on the one hand, when I was kind of initially preparing for the conversation, I was thinking, oh, there's a little bit of fear, that it could be man-made. But I think the way you phrase it is awesome because it's like a very positive interpretation that by knowing that, we can help people reduce their own chances of getting it. And I also appreciate you sharing that about dementia. So I think that's really helpful. I think to kind of like follow up on that, you've mentioned that Parkinson begins outside the brain, not inside it. And I think many people may not have heard that, and it may even help them reframe in how they think about the disease. So can you walk us through that? Like, where does it actually start, and what do you mean by that?
And so when Dr. Parkinson wrote his essay in 1817, he concluded by saying, I look forward to future anatomists who will tell us where the origins of Parkinson's begins. And in 2003, a really smart German pathologist came up with a surprising answer. He said that Parkinson's disease, which we think of a brain disease, does not begin in the brain. Parkinson's disease does not begin in the brain. He said, I've looked at hundreds of brains with Parkinson's disease, and I first find the pathology of Parkinson's disease a misfolded protein. It's called alpha-synuclein, and in Alzheimer's it's beta-amyloid and tau, but different misfolded protein in Parkinson's. He says, I first find it in the smell center, something called the olfactory bulb, or in the nerves that give rise to a nerve called the vagus nerve. Now, some of your listeners might know that the vagus nerve connects the lower part of the brain stem all the way down to the gut and to other organs. It's a really long nerve. It's in someone tall like me, it can be maybe a meter long, 3 feet long. And he says, I first find the pathology, he was concerned that Parkinson's might be due to some kind of pathogen. He didn't know what it was. He thought maybe a virus. We don't think it's likely a virus for most people. But a pathogen that can cross the mucosal barrier in the gut and can lead to pathology that begins perhaps in the gut and then spreads like a falling row of dominoes. Falling row of dominoes was this word. As the pathology spread, for example, to the vagus nerve, and then it would spread upwards to parts of the brain that are responsible for sleep, and then to parts of the brain that are responsible for movement. As the pathology spread, you get new symptoms. When you damage the vagus nerve, which is important for digestion, you get early constipation. As it spreads to the sleep centers, you get people acting out their dreams, such as something called REM sleep behavior disorder, someone striking their bed partner when they're getting chased by a lion in their nightmare, for example. And as it spreads even higher up in the brain, you get to the part of the brain that's classically affected in Parkinson's. It's called the substantia nigra, which gives you the tremor, the slowness of movement, the difficulties with walking, balance that we classically associate with Parkinson's disease. So Heiko Brock in 2003 says that Parkinson's disease, he thought most of it would begin in the gut. In 2019, another really smart scientist who does a lot of work with imaging, his name is Dr. Per Borkhammer, he's in Denmark, and he said there's two forms of Parkinson's disease. There's a form that begins in the gut that Dr. Heiko Brock described in 2003. We'll call that a gut or body first form of the disease. And there's a form that begins in the nose. Remember that Dr. Brock thought that he saw the pathology begin in the smell center, but he didn't make much out of it. Dr. Borkhammer and I agree, think that most of Parkinson's begins in the nose, and as the pathology spreads from the nose, it can spread to part of the brain called the amygdala, which is important in emotions, and then back to the brain called the substantia nigra. It's a very easy way to get from the nose back to the part of the brain classically affected in Parkinson's disease. These individuals might get an early loss of smell, they might get some anxiety or depression because of damage to the amygdala, and then they might get early Parkinsonian features like the tremor and slowness of movement. Two forms of the disease, one beginning in the gut called body or gut first form of the disease, one beginning in the nose called nose or brain first form of the disease. If the pathology begins in the gut or begins in the nose, it begs the question, well, what's causing the pathology to begin in the gut or in the nose? And so I emailed Dr. Borkhammer and I said, fantastic work, read all his work, marked it all up, and I said, how about chemicals that we ingest? Think about pesticides that might be in well water that people drink if they grew up on a farm, might predispose to Parkinson's disease beginning in the gut, versus chemicals that you inhale. Think people living near a golf course might be inhaling lots of pesticides with the pathology beginning in the nose. So I think our hypothesis is that chemicals that people eat, swallow, ingest would lead to a gut or body first form of Parkinson's, beginning with constipation, troubles with sleep disturbances, and then the motor features of the disease, movement features. And chemicals that we inhale, like the Marines, people working with dry cleaning chemicals, people living near farms, inhaling chemicals leading to a nose or brain first form of the disease.
Wow. Wow, that is really fascinating, and I think thanks for explaining it in such great detail. I think, before kind of like jumping to the next question, I guess my one follow-up on that is, you mentioned kind of like the progression begins with things like, let's say if it's starting in the gut with constipation, et cetera, and then progresses. So for anyone out there that might have heard that and thought, oh, could I be exposed? Like, are there early signs before it gets into the brain and kind of becomes less reversible? Like, are there early signs? And at that point, if the exposure is shifted, then is the outcome, potentially modifiable?
Yeah. So, unfortunately, we don't have great answers, but I think the answer is yes. So, early features of the disease are constipation if it begins in the gut, and perhaps loss of smell. Smell tends to be complicated. That can precede it. And we actually know this for Alzheimer's disease too. One of the earliest features of Alzheimer's disease is loss of smell. Turns out one of the major risk factors for Alzheimer's disease is air pollution. When Dr. Parkinson described the condition in 1800 London, he was describing it among the London fog. Air quality in 1800 London is equivalent to what's in Delhi, India. Today it's equivalent to what people are experiencing with wildfires. I was in Colorado, and wildfires there were leading to high levels of air pollution. Not even quite to what it was in 1800 London, but just to give you a sense, when the sky turns orange or gray, that's not normal. And when that air pollution can be inhaled, and when you're inhaling air pollution, you're inhaling little pieces of dirt and soot suspended in the air that you can actually see, and then hitchhiking on the pieces of dirt and soot are heavy metals and other toxic chemicals that could be leading to misfolding of proteins, some implicated in Alzheimer's disease, others in Parkinson's. So what can you do if you've been exposed to these chemicals? I don't think it's a fait accompli. We don't know for certain, but I don't think it's a fait accompli that you've been exposed to these chemicals when you're young, that you are going to develop the disease in the future. I'll give you an example. So we know that people who smoke cigarettes, if you smoke cigarettes in your 20s, you're at increased risk for getting lung cancer or heart disease years later. But if you stop smoking, your risk of heart disease within a year of smoking your last cigarette is decreased. Your risk of lung cancer after you stop smoking within 10 years of smoking your last cigarette is halved. If that's true for smoking and lung cancer and heart disease, why wouldn't the same thing be true for people exposed to toxic pesticides when they were a child, drinking well water, exposed to dry cleaning chemicals, high levels of air pollution? Why, if we stop being exposed halt our exposure to this and exercise and eat a nutritious diet, why can't that modify the course of the disease or decrease the likelihood of developing it or postpone the development? We don't have great studies to answer if that's indeed possible. I certainly think it is, and we can draw analogies from other diseases, whether that's type 2 diabetes or high blood pressure or lung cancer, that when you stop being exposed to the risk factors that are driving the disease in the first place, that can't do anything but help you out.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. I think that's really helpful, and that creates kind of ray of hope in people that might be worried about their risk. I think then jumping into kind of like the pesticides angle, I think you've mentioned that there's a weed killer called Paraquat that the EPA's own website says is like killer. Even one sip can kill you, and it's banned in over 70 countries. I was surprised to learn it's even banned in China. And in America, its usage has doubled, I think, between 2013 and 2018. I guess, what's going on? And actually, is this the same one recently? I was reading a headline that Michigan has started to take some steps, to ban. I guess, what's going on? How is this allowed? What's it doing to people's brains? And kind of what's going on? So
what is Paraquat? If you're not a farmer, you're probably unaware of this chemical. It's a weed killer that was created in the 1960s. It's considered one of the most toxic weed killers ever developed. It kills the weeds that Roundup doesn't. It's so toxic that it's been used to commit homicide and suicide. And as you indicate, the EPA's own website says one sip can kill. In 2011, my outstanding colleague, Dr. Caroline Tanner, showed that farmers who work with Paraquat have a 150% increased risk of developing the disease. Another outstanding colleague, Dr. Beata Ritz, and her colleague, Dr. Kimberly Paul at UCLA, showed in 2023, I believe, that people who simply live or work near where Paraquat is sprayed, they're not even the farmers doing the spraying, you just live near a farm that's using Paraquat, have a doubling of their risk of Parkinson's disease. And my colleague, Dr. Debbie Korschlech at the University of Rochester, she showed in the 1990s that laboratory animals exposed to Paraquat developed the clinical and pathological features of the disease. They move around less, and you look at their brain, they look like they have Parkinson's disease, or they have features of it. So why are we still using it? It's sprayed on corn, cotton, soybeans, and vineyards throughout the United States. Over 70 countries, including China, has banned it. England won't let it be used in England, but exports it to the United States, or at least it did so until recently. The EPA has failed to protect farmers from this and failed to protect other people who live or work near where it's sprayed. The good news is that in March, its principal manufacturer, not its only manufacturer, its principal manufacturer said that it was getting out of the Paraquat business and was going to stop producing the chemical this past June. And Vermont, as you alluded to, just a couple months ago became the first state in the union to ban Paraquat. So if you're a farmer in Paraquat or you live near a farm, which many people do, you're going to stop being exposed to a weed killer that's associated with 150% increased risk of Parkinson's. If we get these chemicals out of our environment, if we remove the most toxic pesticides that are linked to Parkinson's disease, if we remove dry cleaning chemicals, think about that, dry cleaning chemicals that are linked to Parkinson's disease, if we stop using them, if we work on continuing to reduce air pollution in New York City, which is far cleaner air today in 2026 than it did in 2006, for example, if we continue to clean our air, we create a world where Parkinson's disease is increasingly rare instead of increasingly common. We create a world where Alzheimer's disease is increasingly rare instead of increasingly common. We create a world where ALS, Lou Gehrig's disease, is increasingly rare instead of increasingly common. These diseases, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, ALS, dementia with Lewy bodies, these are all diseases that have been described in the last 200 years. Doctors have described seizures, migraines, and strokes for centuries, if not millennia. These classic neurodegenerative diseases are all newly described. I think they all have very modest genetic components to them. I think the principal causes of these diseases are chemicals in our food, water, and air. We address these chemicals in our food, water, and air. We create a world where these diseases are increasingly rare instead of increasingly common.
Wow, thank you for such a detailed explanation. I think, if you could kind of go a little bit into, because the Paraquat example I think is very interesting to think about, but like you said, most people will likely not be, farming themselves, but they may be exposed to the food they eat. But I thought your comment about the dry cleaning chemicals was also fascinating, and I remember you've talked about that quite significantly, because that is something many people either are directly exposed to through their clothing, or in big cities they may be even living nearby. But could you elaborate on that? If speaking of the chemical usage, I guess maybe the two main vectors that people might be exposed to would be the dry cleaning chemicals and the potential golf course chemicals. Would you elaborate on those?
Yes, give me 1 second here.
Sure.
Here we go. I'm obsessed with this chemical. It's called trichloroethylene.
Okay.
It's called, and it's got a dry cleaning chemical called perchloroethylene. So what is trichloroethylene? It's abbreviated TCE. So a little chemistry lesson. Most of your listeners know that water, H2O, is made up of 3 atoms, 2 hydrogens and 1 oxygen. Trichloroethylene is made up of a whopping 6 atoms, 2 carbons in black, 1 hydrogen in white, and 3 chlorine atoms in blue, hence its name trichloroethylene. Its dry clean cousin has 1 additional chlorine atom, so it's called either tetra or perchloroethylene. Per just means 4. And it turns out these chemicals, again, done by research by Dr. Caroline Tanner and Dr. Sam Goldman, show that people who are exposed to these chemicals have about a 500% increased risk of developing disease, 500%. In the laboratory, they also reproduce the features of Parkinson's disease, especially trichloroethylene. and they're widely used in dry cleaning. Trichloroethylene was used in dry cleaning until about the 1950s, I believe, until it was supplanted by perchloroethylene. Most dry cleaners in the United States, except in California, which has banned this chemical, use perchloroethylene. The reason we use dry cleaning, do you know why we have dry cleaners? Do you know what the advantage of dry cleaners are? Do you know why we use dry cleaning?
Yeah.
We use dry cleaning, I didn't know this stuff either, I'm a neurologist, is so that our clothes don't shrink, because water makes cotton shrink, and so we develop chemicals like trichloroethylene, perchloroethylene, so our clothes don't shrink. The price for our clothes not shrinking should not be an increased risk for Parkinson's disease. The price for our clothes not shrinking should not be Parkinson's disease. The price for green golf courses should not be Parkinson's disease. The price for a weed killer should not be Parkinson's disease. These chemicals, trichloroethylene, not only used previously used in dry cleaning, but it was used to degrease metals. So if you worked in printing or painting, if you were an embalmer, if you worked in Silicon Valley, if you worked in a mechanic, if you worked on jet aircraft engines, if you served in the military, if you served at Camp Lejeune, you were quite possibly been exposed to trichloroethylene. It's estimated in the 1970, 2 pounds of this chemical were produced per American. Still, I think the most recent data I saw is 250 million pounds of trichloroethylene are used in the United States. Estimated 10 million Americans worked with this chemical in 1970. It was even used to decaffeinate coffee until the FDA banned that use, I think, in 1977. And so this chemical widely used, people exposed to it at work, people are exposed to it in dry cleaners. People, even when they bring their dry cleaning home, if you take off the bag, they are off-gassing that chemical into your home. And then this chemical is oftentimes been inappropriately disposed of. So it's estimated that up to 30% of groundwater in the United States is contaminated with this chemical. So you could be drinking it, or the chemical, kind of like radon, I think many of your listeners know radon can evaporate from soil and enter people's homes, often basements, and increase the risk for lung cancer. Trichloroethylene can evaporate from soil or contaminated water and enter people's homes and cause cancer. This is known to be a carcinogen according to the EPA, known to cause cancer according to the Environmental Protection Agency. And it likely can increase your risk of Parkinson's disease. In our book, we detail countless individuals who were exposed to trichloroethylene, everything from attorneys working in an office tower in Rochester, New York, to Marines who served at Camp Lejeune, to people who worked in the family dry cleaning business, who were all likely exposed to the chemical or perchloroethylene and then developed Parkinson's disease decades later.
Wow. That's very scary. Thanks for sharing. And I think some of those things I hadn't even thought about, that this thing was used to decaffeinate coffee. I mean, it's like the, kind of inadvertent exposure that people got. That's very scary.
And it's important to recognize these exposures are happening without people's knowledge and without their consent. You live near a golf course, you have no expectation that you're being exposed to chemicals that are designed to damage the nervous system of insects, and that you're getting involuntary exposure to these chemicals simply by the virtue of living near a golf course. Especially if you live downwind of a golf course, you could be breathing in these chemicals. No one asked you whether you wanted to be exposed to these chemicals. No one asked you for your consent, and you're paying a really, really high price if you have the disease or you're caring for someone with these diseases. These diseases have an enormous human cost and they have an enormous economic cost. It's estimated that the economic burden of Parkinson's disease is about $50 billion a year to society, half of it to Medicare and increased healthcare expenses, and half to individuals in terms of caregiver costs, lost wages, caregiving, out-of-pocket expenses. For Alzheimer's disease, I think the estimates are around $300 billion, if not more. Why are we paying such a high price as humans and as a society for diseases that are preventable? If we took action to eliminate the underlying risk factors for these diseases, whether they're certain pesticides, whether it's dry cleaning chemicals, or whether it's outdoor air pollution, we can all live longer, healthier lives, free of these neurodegenerative diseases, and stop spending $1 in $5 in the United States on sick care, and stop burdening 35 million Americans who are caring for people with adults with disabling conditions, with Parkinson's and Alzheimer's being the most common of this. These are preventable plagues that are affecting just about every American household, and quite frankly, a lot of households around the world. And we can take action to prevent people from suffering from it, just like we took action, 50 years ago and 70 years ago to prevent polio. We've taken action to prevent HIV. We've taken action to prevent drinking and driving. We can do the same thing for Parkinson's. We can do the same thing for Alzheimer's. We can do the same thing for ALS.
Yeah, I totally agree, and I think the way you framed it is also very interesting, because I remember I was hearing something that you said a while back where you had a very interesting statistic. I might botch the number, but you were saying something like Parkinson cost in America is like $50 billion a year, but the company making that chemical is making like $500 million a year, and you're like, well, if you can't regulate it, what if you just pay him $500 million to just do nothing? I thought that was kind of interesting, because I feel like sometimes the government's like behind the curve on regulating business, and it's such like a free market kind of approach of companies can do whatever. But if you just literally give them a payment and just say, hey, I'll pay you to keep your factory shut because it's saving me $25 billion a year of Medicare costs, and it only costs you $500 million, just take the money and stop doing it. I thought that was like really, like the magnitude is insane. But I guess, could you elaborate a little bit on that? Of like, how much are these companies making from these chemicals? And is it really like a small bit of their profit is resulting in this massive societal economic burden, not to mention the human burden, but just thinking some of these companies are only money oriented. I think, could you explain that, and is it really that drastic?
Yeah, so I think reporting from The Guardian reported that estimated that global sales, not profits, global sales of Paraquat were $400 million. I told you a study led by the Michael J. Fox Foundation estimated that the economic burden to Americans alone is $50 billion from Parkinson's disease. If we prevented just 1%, if Paraquat were just responsible for 1% of Parkinson's disease, that would be an economic burden to the U.S. taxpayers and people with the disease of $500 million, more than the global sales, not profits, of Paraquat. An economist wrote me and said, Ray, what you should do is just tax it. A great idea, but in fact, the United States, we subsidize it. So the United States taxpayers, you, me, and your listeners pay about $15 billion for agricultural subsidies. The two crops that are subsidized with the most money in the United States are corn and soybeans. The two crops that are sprayed with the most Paraquat in the United States are corn and soybeans.
Wow. I think that's something for everyone to think about. That's really profound and sad. But thanks for sharing. I think the numbers are really mind-numbing. I think there was also, I think, going to the other chemicals. I think you discussed about the dry cleaning chemical of TCE, and I thought that one of the interesting things that you'd said was it's sitting at these Superfund sites in Silicon Valley. I actually am curious to learn more about that, because we run this nationwide caregiving platform, and I've seen a lot of the people that we help in California, in like that San Francisco broader area, are older adults living with Parkinson, and surprisingly, these are wealthy older adults. So I've been wondering, like, is there something going on? And you'd mentioned that, especially I think in this chemical, whether it's the Superfund sites in Silicon Valley, which I believe might be the old semiconductor factories, or I think you'd even mentioned that females who work in dry cleaning have a 1,500% higher chance of Parkinson. I guess, what's going on? And I guess, are some of these like residuals where even if you don't work in the thing, it's just in the land, or how are people exposed to it?
Yeah, so TC was used, trichloroethylene was widely used to clean silicon wafers, and Silicon Valley obviously had a lot of silicon wafers to be cleaned, and I think there are 11 Superfund sites along a 7-mile stretch of the 101 freeway in Silicon Valley. And these are at former semiconductor plants like Intel and Fairchild Semiconductors. These are Superfund sites designated by the EPA because they're among the most toxic sites in the country, designated for cleanup. And so people who simply live or work near where these chemicals have been inappropriately disposed of, or in some cases honestly leaked from underground storage tanks, they're at risk for drinking contaminated water, and they're at risk for something called vapor intrusion, when these chemicals evaporate from underlying contaminated water and soil into people's homes, schools, and workplaces without their knowledge and without their consent. So you could be living nearest one of these contaminated sites. Jane Horton is a woman featured in our first book who lived right near one of these contaminated sites that's under, under the campus of Google presently. She had her indoor air tested, found to have elevated levels of TCE in her indoor air. This chemical is known to cause cancer and is associated with an increased risk of Parkinson's, 500% increased risk of Parkinson's. She had a simple equivalent of a radon remediation system put into her home, sucks the air from underneath her foundation, vents it above her roof, and she says that I have the cleanest air in Mountain View, California. And so she can breathe air in her home without being worried about developing cancer or Parkinson's disease. We're a wealthy nation. We've made mistakes. We realized that the dangers of these chemicals, in some cases we've discovered them after they've been produced. We can take action to prevent people from being exposed to these chemicals. We've done this before. In the 1970s, 95% of American children had unsafe levels of lead in their blood. Children were being admitted to the hospital with encephalopathy. There were large numbers of children with intellectual disabilities because of lead. We got lead out of gasoline, lead out of paint, and today lead levels in American children are 95% lower than when I was a kid in the 1970s. It's estimated that because of this reduction in the lead levels in the blood, that leads to higher IQs of 3 to 4 points per child because of this. If we want to reduce intellectual disabilities, if we want to reduce autism, if we want to reduce ALS, if we want to reduce Parkinson's disease, if we want to create a world where people aren't suffering with Alzheimer's disease or spending their lives caring for someone with Alzheimer's disease, we know how to do it. We've done it before. We've done it with lead. We've done it with polio. We've done it with HIV. We've done it with drinking and driving. We can do the same thing by doing it with certain pesticides, with dry cleaning and degreasing chemicals, and with outdoor air pollution. We can create a world where these diseases are largely not around, just like they haven't been for 99.9% of human history.
Wow, amen. I totally agree with that, and I think it's remarkable, kind of the impact that can be made. I think on the golf courses side, I think just to kind of drill down on that, because that's another salient example, for a lot of people. And I think you've mentioned that living within a mile more than doubles your risk. It's like both the impact of if you live nearby and you catch the downwind chemicals. Is it also being on the course and just people who are very frequently golfing? And what is that? I think some of your stats were the golf course uses 5 times more pesticide per acre than a farm. And I guess maybe just because in order to keep it very well maintained. But if you're in this situation, let's say maybe forget even living near, if you're just an active golfer and you're out there a bunch, are you exposed just from being on the course? What do people need to know? And whether or not you're golfing or living near, what can you do that's within your control?
So in the most viewed article in the entire JAMA network, the Journal of the American Medical Association, last year was work done by my colleague, Dr. Brittany Krasinowski, and her colleague, Dr. Rodolfo Savica, a neurologist at the Mayo Clinic. Dr. Krasinowski is a geographer. She's actually just sitting outside my door right now. And she and Dr. Savica and her colleagues, they looked at the risk of Parkinson's disease among people who live near a golf course in Rochester, Minnesota. And they found that people where the Mayo Clinic is located, and they found that individuals who live within a mile of a golf course in Rochester, Minnesota had a 126% increased risk of developing Parkinson's disease compared to people who live more than 6 miles away. What does living near a golf course have to do with Parkinson's disease? As you alluded to, golf courses are huge consumers of pesticides. According to at least one study, golf courses use 5 times as much pesticides per acre as do farms. And some of the pesticides used on golf courses, especially in the past and even today, are unsafe or are known to damage the nervous system of insects, for example. 2 of them, one's called chlorpyrifos, a pesticide widely sprayed on golf courses, widely sprayed on apple orchards, for example, was actually banned by the EPA in 2021 because it's estimated to have cost American children 16 million IQ points. Unfortunately, that ban was overturned because its manufacturer successfully sued to overturn that ban, allowing it, depending on the state, to again be sprayed on apple orchards and to be sprayed on golf courses. Another pesticide weed killer widely sprayed on golf courses is 2,4-D. A few of your listeners might recall that 2,4-D was a component of Agent Orange, sprayed over North Vietnam during the Vietnam War. We know that Agent Orange is linked to Parkinson's disease. We're spraying a weed killer that was used in warfare on golf greens to make sure that golf courses are green. Rachel Carson in 1962 wrote Silent Spring not against pesticides, but against the indiscriminate use of pesticides. I think almost all of us can agree that we shouldn't be using weed killers from warfare on golf courses, especially when we know that those weed killers damage dopamine-producing nerve cells that are lost in Parkinson's disease in the lab, and we know that Agent Orange is linked to Parkinson's disease and a wide range of other diseases, including many cancers. It's possible people could be exposed to it by Dr. Brittany Krasnowski and Dr. Savika looked at people who lived near it. These weren't people spraying it on the courses. These were, again, just people like secondhand smoke. That they could either have been exposed to the chemical, these pesticides, in the water that they were drinking, which Dr. Krasnowski detailed in the paper. I get really concerned they could also be breathing it in, or be breathing it in because of their proximity to it. There's one small case report that showed that people who lived downwind of a golf course appeared to be at higher risk of Parkinson's disease than those who didn't. So that's just looking at people who live near a golf course. It turns out there are 3 studies that link green space workers, including, for example, landscapers on golf courses, to Parkinson's disease, and 1 study that links green space workers to an increased risk of ALS or Lou Gehrig's disease. There are also studies in Italy, Spain, and Scotland, all linking soccer playing, we're talking about the World Cup, soccer playing to an increased risk of ALS. I worry about, obviously, head trauma from hitting the ball, but I also worry about people playing on sports fields where these pesticides are sprayed. They could be either inhaling it, or some of these chemicals are fat-loving, so they can be absorbed through the skin. I think we need to look and say, why are we spraying nerve toxins on our golf courses? Why are we spraying chemicals that are known to damage nervous systems on kids' playgrounds and schools? Why are we finding arsenic in baseball fields where little leaguers are playing? Why are we finding lead in the soil of residents? If we get rid of these chemicals, and it's really easy to test for these chemicals in your soil on the sports field, we can create a world where people aren't suffering with these terrible conditions. Anyone who's seen someone with ALS, anyone who's seen someone with Parkinson's disease, almost all of us have encountered a friend or family member with Alzheimer's disease, recognize these are terrible conditions that we would not want for ourselves, conditions we would not want for our families, conditions, quite frankly, people say I wouldn't even wish upon my enemies. These diseases are by and large preventable. The genetic contributions to Parkinson's disease are less than 15%. The portion of people with ALS that's due to primarily genetic causes is less than 15%. Monogenic, single genetic causes of Alzheimer's disease are extraordinarily low, less than 5%. The principal causes of these diseases do not lie inside of us. They're not in our DNA. They're not in our genes. They're outside of us, in the air we breathe, the water we drink, and the food we eat.
Wow. Yeah, that is, I think that's a really interesting reframe. And I think it really, hopefully people out there listening, this inspires people to kind of start advocating to kind of watch what chemicals we're using and, potentially hold some of these companies accountable. I think on that topic of external environment, I think another thing that you have noted is like the air pollution side. That air pollution may cost every human about 3 years of life. Toxic metals are coming into our noses and into our brains through the suit. Like where do you find in America, at least, where is the air pollution kind of notable, and what are the mechanisms of air pollution to kind of neurological disorders?
So air pollution is more disabling than high blood pressure. more to say than high blood pressure. And think about, you go to the doctor, your kid sprains his ankle and he's going to get his blood pressure checked. But we don't even measure air pollutants in people with Alzheimer's disease, even though we know it's linked to the disease. We don't even measure it in people with Parkinson's, even though we know it's linked to the disease. We don't measure it in people with asthma, even though we know it's linked to the disease. I just think we've been asleep on air pollution, and I think it's playing a huge role in brain diseases. I think the nose is your front door to your brain. And when you breathe in a chemical, you're bypassing some normal protective measures that we have. Normally, if you ingest a chemical, we have a gut and membranes to prevent it. We have a liver to detoxify chemicals that come in through the gut. And we have the blood-brain barrier, which restricts access to the brain from toxic chemicals, many toxic chemicals. I think the nose is an exploitation to it, and it bypasses the gut, it bypasses the liver, and it bypasses the blood-brain barrier. It turns out that some of those little pieces of dirt and soot that we talked about before, they're called particulate matter. Some are 1/30th the width of my hair. They're 2.5 microns. They're 2 1,000ths of a millimeter in size, some even smaller. And they can penetrate the nerve responsible for smell that hangs up in our upper nasal passages. They can just go through the nerve itself, pierce it. And they can bring in toxic metals like lead, like iron, like platinum, lead from gasoline, iron from brakes, platinum from catalytic converters. We know that the brains of individuals with Parkinson's disease and Alzheimer's disease have increased concentrations of metals in them, and we really haven't been able to explain why. I get concerned, not known for sure, that this is in part due to toxic metals being inhaled into the brain. We know that one of the first places you find both the pathology of Parkinson's disease and the pathology of Alzheimer's disease is in the smell center of the olfactory bulb. We know one of the earliest features of disease are loss of smell for both of that, which precedes both the tremor and slowness of movement in Parkinson's and the memory loss in Alzheimer's disease. And there have been a wide number of studies that have linked air pollution to Alzheimer's disease, and an increasing number of studies linking air pollution, especially higher levels of air pollution, to Parkinson's disease. I don't think it's terribly surprising that countries in the world that have high levels of air pollution have high levels of Alzheimer's disease and high levels of Parkinson's disease. Study after study, almost weekly now, linking studies of air pollution to Alzheimer's disease. This is all preventable. Air quality in 1960 in California was so bad that people wore masks, not because of concerns about COVID or infections. They wore masks because the air was so toxic to breathe. The governor of California said in the 1960s we should ban all unnecessary driving because air pollution was so bad. That governor was responsible for creating some of the first air pollution boards in that state. That governor was Ronald Reagan. And Ronald Reagan, as some people know, became the first president ever to be diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease. I don't think it's a coincidence that Ronald Reagan, who spent a large portion of his adult life in Los Angeles breathing in heavily polluted air, would be at increased risk for developing Alzheimer's disease. If we address air pollution, if we reduce air pollution as we have, there are more cars driving more miles by more people in Los Angeles today, and the air quality is vastly better, double, 5 times, 10 times better than it was in the 1960s and 70s, and the economy is booming in Los Angeles. Having clean air is not a trade-off for economic development. Having clean air, clean food, and clean water is a prerequisite for a healthy, thriving society. We've seen that in Los Angeles. We've seen that in different parts of the world. We see China having the fastest improving air quality in the world in China because they realize that air pollution is not good for a healthy society. If we wake up, if we see what's actually in front of us, we can create a world where 7 million Americans aren't suffering with Alzheimer's disease, where tens of millions of Americans aren't caring for someone with dementia, and where 1 in 3 85-year-olds are not resigned to developing Alzheimer's disease. That is an unnatural consequence of aging. It is not a natural consequence of aging. We can create a world where 85-year-olds are not battling Parkinson's disease and Alzheimer's disease, but 85-year-olds are thriving and serving as wonderful grandparents and contributors to society.
Thanks. I mean, that's absolutely fascinating. And by the way, thanks for sharing the history lesson. I had no idea about Ronald Reagan and kind of what he did to improve air quality in LA, and also about his later battle with Alzheimer's. I think that's really interesting. I think in some of the things that you had mentioned, I think on Camp Lejeune, I think these are just like really interesting like vectors of like illness that you don't think about. That could you tell us a little bit about that Marines who were 20 years old, when they were exposed to the drinking water in Camp Lejeune and the TCE, I mean, these people are serving our country, and only as little as I think a 20-something months of exposure, and 30 years later they have a 70% higher rate of Parkinson. Like, what is going on, through that? Is it the same kind of mechanism as discussed earlier?
Yeah, so what's Camp Lejeune? So Camp Lejeune's a large a Marine base in Wilmington, North Carolina. If you're a young Marine, the two main places you get trained are at Camp Pendleton in California or Camp Lejeune on the East Coast. And from 1953 to 1987, the drinking water at Camp Lejeune was contaminated with trichloroethylene. Among the sources of contamination was a dry cleaning site just off the base. Marine officers need to have their uniforms dry cleaned. Not surprisingly, they went to a dry cleaner. These chemicals were inappropriately disposed of and contaminated the drinking water from 53 to 1987. The Marine base is like, you should think like, it's like Ohio State University. It's a huge college campus. It's got a Walmart. It's got an elementary school. It's got, grocery stores and everything like that. It's estimated that 1 million people, Marines, service members, their spouses, and civilians were exposed from 1953 to 1987. And the Marine Corps knew about this contamination for the latter years and did nothing about it. So the Marine Corps knowingly exposed the best and brightest among us, the most dedicated servants in our society, to a cancer-causing chemical that's linked to Parkinson's disease. Dr. Caroline Tanner and Dr. Sam Goldman, again at UC San Francisco, looked at Marines who served at Camp Lejeune. I think in the 1970s, their average age was 20. Some were teenagers. These are young, healthy, I think 95% of them were men. And then they looked at these individuals 40 years later, and after 34 years on average, they had a 70% increased risk of developing Parkinson's compared to Marines who served at Camp Pendleton. Importantly, their exposure happened at a young age. Those of you who served our country, first of all, thank you very much. Second, they know that you only serve at a base for a short period of time. The average duration of exposure was 25 months. I think the minimum exposure in the study was just 3 months. Yet 34 years later, they had a 70% increased risk of disease. The health that we enjoy today is not a reflection of our current environment. The health we enjoy today is largely a reflection of the environment that we've had in the past. This is especially true for these neurodegenerative diseases like Parkinson's and Alzheimer's, where the seeds of these diseases are often planted at a young age. In this case, in people in their 20s or younger. I've now met 4 individuals who were either a child born or conceived at Camp Lejeune and then later developed the disease. If you prevent your children and your grandchildren from getting exposed to outdoor air pollution, from getting exposed to certain pesticides, from getting exposed to certain dry cleaning chemicals, you can set them up to enjoy a life that is largely free of Parkinson's and Alzheimer's. What a beautiful gift to give to your children and grandchildren. And if you're among the 6 million Americans with Alzheimer's disease, or you're among the 1.2 million Americans with Parkinson's disease, and you stop being exposed to these chemicals, you might be able to favorably slow the rate of progression of these diseases. There are studies, for example, that show that people with Parkinson's disease who are exposed to pesticides have a faster rate of progression. Why don't we have people who have Parkinson's disease to stop being exposed to these pesticides? The same is true for air pollution. People with Parkinson's disease who are exposed to higher levels of air pollution after their diagnosis are more likely to be hospitalized for their Parkinson's disease. I think we're missing a tremendous opportunity to slow the rate of dementia, to slow the rate of Parkinson's disease by halting or reducing exposure to the toxins that are contributing to the disease in the first place.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. And by the way, while you were talking, I was thinking, I live in North Carolina, about an hour and a half from Camp Lejeune, and in recent years, actually in the last year, I'm in my 40s, I've had two friends die of rare cancers that were suddenly onset and progressed very fast, both in that area. And these were men in their 40s, otherwise very healthy. And it was devastating to their wife and kids. And been kind of like thinking that what's going on. And I think that in that area, I think there is a challenge with kind of not just they were born and grew up there, but also what might be in the water and the chemical exposures in the water. So I think that's really scary.
Diseases have causes. Diseases have causes. Essential tenet of Western medicine is that diseases have causes. You don't get cancer because your aunt sinned. You get cancer because you were exposed to a cancer-causing chemical, or you were exposed to radiation, or you carry a rare genetic mutation. You get a cold because you were exposed to some virus that's linked to a cold. The vast majority of people with these exposures do not develop the disease. We're all exposed to cold viruses. Where you're sitting right now, where I'm sitting right now, there is undoubtedly adenoviruses hanging out in our air. And most of us aren't exposed to disease. Only 15% of smokers get lung cancer. Only 10% of people exposed to asbestos get mesothelioma. What determines why some people get the disease and why some don't? There's factors around exposures, interactions, including possibly genetic, and some modifiers. But our job as physicians is to identify the causes of diseases. If you identify the cause of disease, 1, you can prevent the disease. 2, you can slow it. And 3, you can cure it. People want a cure for Alzheimer's disease. People want a cure for Parkinson's disease. Your listeners want cures for Parkinson's and Alzheimer's. The prerequisite to curing a disease is to know its cause. I can't think of a single disease that we can cure with a pill where we don't first know its cause. When I was in medical school, we didn't really have a good sense of what was causing hepatitis C, which is a virus that affects the liver. It was initially called non-hep A, non-hep B, because we weren't even sure if it was a virus, and all we knew it wasn't hepatitis A and it wasn't hepatitis B. We figured out that it was hepatitis C, a virus, and you can now take a pill to cure people from hepatitis C. Hepatitis C used to be a leading cause of liver transplant in the United States, a bloody mess. You have to harvest an organ from a dying individual, transplant that organ into somebody who was in poor health, and treat them with immunosuppressive treatments, a very expensive and bloody mess. Now we cure it when we know its cause. It used to be in the 1960s, bleeding ulcers, stomach ulcers was a top 10 leading cause of death in the United States. We thought that bleeding ulcers was due to stress. We were wrong. We figured out, 2 Australian scientists figured out that it was due to a bacteria. People thought the bacteria couldn't possibly live in the acidic environment of the stomach. They were ridiculed and largely marginalized. They were right, their critics were wrong. Now almost no one dies of a bleeding ulcer because bleeding ulcers are curable with antibiotics and some other medications. You take a cocktail. You probably haven't heard last person that you heard that dying of a bleeding ulcer, which, as I said, was the top 10 leading cause of death. If we find the causes of the disease, and I think for Parkinson's, for Alzheimer's, is due to ALS or chemicals in our food, water, and air, we can prevent them, we can slow them, and we're far better positioned to cure these diseases, because when you know the cause of the disease, you can screen lots and lots of chemicals against those causes in the laboratory and accelerate the time to getting highly effective treatment for these diseases.
Thank you. I think that's, I love the history lesson too, and I think that's a great, it actually sparks optimism, that we were able to beat these other things by getting to the root cause, and I think that is something that a lot of our listeners and people in the caregiving community are very interested in. I think that leads me to kind of the next thing that you've said that Michael J. Fox thinks he got Parkinson's from a chemical exposure, and there were other stories like Brian Grant, the NBA player, was 3 years old when his father was stationed at Camp Lejeune, and he played in the NBA once a full season with Parkinson's without even knowing it. I guess. Yeah. Can you elaborate on those stories and what happened to Michael J. Fox? That what type of chemical exposure may have led to it, and what does it mean that the disease can be planted in your body but then manifest outwardly decades later?
Yes. So Michael J. Fox said in an interview with Jane Pauley that he thought he got Parkinson's from exposure to some kind of chemical. Brian Grant, I was reading his autobiography, and toward the end he mentioned that he was a 3-year-old boy, that his father was a Marine stationed at Camp Lejeune when he was 3, and so he was on the base. I literally, my jaw dropped, literally almost dropped the book, because that could explain why Brian Grant is 3 years old. 33 years later, at age 36, he's diagnosed with Parkinson's disease, and his father dies of esophageal cancer linked to trichloroethylene, which, as I told you before, is known to cause cancer. Diseases have causes. We figure out what the causes of disease are. We can help prevent it, slow it, treat it, inform family members of their risk or lack thereof of the disease, and create a world without these chemicals and without these diseases. This is all within our control. We've done this before. We've done it with lead. We've done it with CFCs. We've done it with DDT. We've done it time and time again. It's just another time we need to answer the bell, because the bell is ringing really loudly. Brain diseases are the world's leading source of disability, more so than cancer, more disabling than heart disease, more disabling than infectious diseases, including COVID. People, your listeners know this, they're among the 35 million people caring for someone with a neurodegenerative condition. These diseases are unnatural. When I see someone with Parkinson's, I get upset, because I think the suffering that they have is immense. And I think that suffering is largely unnecessary, and that suffering is largely preventable. The sooner we awaken to this fact, the sooner we create a world where people aren't dying from Parkinson's, aren't dying from Alzheimer's disease, aren't suffering with these diseases, aren't spending their time, resources, and lives caring for or suffering with preventable conditions.
Yeah, no, thank you for sharing. And I think you're right also on the caring side. I've personally just been a caregiver, family members through cancer and through neurological disorders, and the caregiving burden is immensely different, mainly because some of those things like cancer are like typically episodic, and it's a massive amount of stress in a time period of a year or two. But these neurodegenerative disorders are lifetime of caregiving that often lasts for people 5 years, 10 years, and beyond. So it is a massive, massive societal challenge, So I think, yeah, thanks for sharing, the perspective. I think, in some of these things, that you mentioned that, you've had patients who delayed, needing medication for years through exercise alone. You've had patients, and I assume these are Parkinson patients, that came off medication entirely and have managed their disease through lifestyle. So I think maybe on like the kind of the ray of hope side and the positive things, these things sound almost impossible, but what are those patients doing differently? And if anyone out there is listening that's caring for a loved one with Parkinson's, like what can they realistically aim for? Like what are other ways to improve health?
I think, I don't know, but I think we've been underestimating how modifiable these diseases are, whether that's Parkinson's or whether that's Alzheimer's disease, for example. We know that there are people who are in physically better shape today with Parkinson's disease than they were before they had Parkinson's disease. Our book opens with the story of Dr. Sarah Whittingham, a graduate of the U.S. Air Force Academy in Colorado Springs, who served her country around the world, including in Afghanistan, was a physician trained through the Air Force, and was likely exposed to trichloroethylene at many of the military bases where she served, including one where she was responsible for overseeing the degreasing and cleaning of jet engines that were flown in Iraq. And she developed Parkinson's disease, and after initial depression and significant decline in her health, started exercising and ran an Ironman triathlon after she had Parkinson's disease. If you can run an Ironman triathlon with Parkinson's disease, it strongly suggests that the disease is modifiable. And I think we're missing opportunities to do that. You and your listeners know about the benefits of exercise, which can be quite beneficial in people with Parkinson's disease and likely beneficial for people with Alzheimer's disease. I think we're missing an opportunity to stop getting exposed to these chemicals. If someone's diagnosed with high blood pressure, the doctor's going to tell them to reduce their salt intake. If someone's diagnosed with diabetes, type 2 diabetes, they're going to be told to improve their diet and to exercise. Why aren't we doing the same thing for people with Parkinson's and Alzheimer's? Why aren't we telling people with Parkinson's and Alzheimer's to really stop being exposed to outdoor air pollution? Why can't we be telling people to get air purifiers in their homes, in their bedrooms, in their living rooms? Roll up their windows if they're driving through heavily trafficked areas, recirculate the air in your home. There are dozens of ways to reduce exposure to outdoor air pollution that I think we're missing. And then, getting really good care. And that doesn't mean just care from a neurologist or a physician with expertise in Parkinson's or Alzheimer's, but that means speech therapy, occupational therapy, exercise therapy, a nutritionist, psychologist, and others, because we know that these diseases don't just affect memory or movement. These diseases are whole brain diseases. In many cases, these diseases are extra brain diseases. They begin outside of the brain, and as the pathology spreads, like those falling row of dominoes that Dr. Brock described, new symptoms appear. And as the pathology spreads throughout the brain, more and more symptoms appear, and they require more and more expertise. But fundamentally, we're not going to address the pandemic of Parkinson's disease. We're not going to address the pandemic of Alzheimer's disease until we go upstream, identify the root causes, and create a world without these diseases.
No, I think I totally agree, and I think thanks for sharing that especially the story, of kind of being able to run an Ironman. I think that creates hope and something that even people living with these diseases can kind of, think about on a positive side, and maybe lifestyle modifications that people could make. I think many people listening right now may be caring for a parent or a spouse. I think most of our listeners are caregivers caring for a parent or spouse, either with dementia, Parkinson, other neurological disorders. I think, what do you think many families that you talk to don't quite understand about what's happening inside their loved one's brain? And especially people who are new to the diagnosis, which a lot of people reach out to us for help. What do you think would be most helpful for them to know within the first few months, so that they can both process it better and also better plan for caring for their loved one?
I think there's just no way to sugarcoat it. These diseases, Michael J. Fox says that Parkinson's disease sucks and Alzheimer's disease sucks even more. They're terrible diseases, and I've outlined that I think these diseases are far more modifiable than we let on, and I think there are ways to modify the course in a favorable way. We talked about exercise, we talked about reducing exposure to these chemicals, we talked about getting really good care. But fundamentally, these diseases are unnatural. These are unnatural consequences of aging. It has never been the case in human history that 1 in 3 85-year-olds get Alzheimer's disease. That is not normal. John Adams at age 90 was writing letters to Thomas Jefferson at age 83. Both were sharp and clear. Neither of them had Alzheimer's disease. Neither of them had Parkinson's disease. These are products of our environment. The sooner we recognize that these diseases are preventable, the Lancet Commission says that 45% of Alzheimer's disease is potentially preventable. If 45% of Alzheimer's is potentially preventable, what does it mean for diseases like Parkinson's and ALS, which are far less heritable than Alzheimer's disease? Out of every research dollar spent on Parkinson's disease, only 2 cents, only 2 pennies is spent on trying to prevent the disease. There will be second and third homes sold for more money today in New York City than we as a society spend on preventing Parkinson's disease. If we are not willing to spend money on preventing Parkinson's disease to find out what these root environmental causes of it, then 100 more Americans are going to die with Parkinson's disease tomorrow. 250 more Americans will be diagnosed with the disease tomorrow. We have a chance to change the course of Parkinson's disease, change the course of Alzheimer's disease, quite frankly, change the course of society for just about every American of all political persuasions, of all ages, of all income levels, by addressing the root causes. We are looking for a call to action to change the course of these diseases. Spending $1 in of every $5 of the wealthiest nation in the history of the world on sick care is a great indication that things are sick. And the reason that we are sick is because chemicals in our food, water, and air are polluting the air we breathe, the food we eat, and the water we drink. The sooner we clean these up, the sooner we create a world where Parkinson's disease is falling, where Alzheimer's disease is waning, not waxing, and the sooner where diseases like ALS are increasingly rare. These are not normal consequences of aging. It's never been the case in human history that it's been like this. The sooner we recognize that, the sooner we create a world without this disease, and the sooner we stop the suffering, the tears, the agony, the frustration that millions, tens of millions of Americans are experiencing on a daily basis, and hundreds of millions of people around the world are experiencing. This is something that we can address, something that we are called to do so, and something that our generation should bring about the fall of.
I really love how you phrased it, and frankly, it's just kind of a random question, but I feel like, have you ever thought about like running for a political office? Like, I don't hear people saying any of these things, you know, and I'm not super politically attuned, but like I listen to what people are saying, and advocacy like this, especially because I work in caregiving every day, I've never heard anyone, you know, kind of advocate that in an open platform, that both it's modifiable and how to do it. But yeah, you know, I'm half joking, but have you considered that, or have you seen people that you see out there that are aspiring policymakers that are kind of advocating this platform? Because I think it's affecting a lot of people. I think caregiving overall is not something, you know, that's talked about enough, and I've often told, you know, candidates and people I meet that, hey, we need to talk about caregiving. But I think this entire thing that you've laid out about the modifiability of, you know, because it's like then it's the person's health and the caregiver's burden can both be reduced. Yeah, have you thought about it, or have you seen people embrace this idea?
So if people want to help support our efforts to get the word out and our research, they can email us at info@pdplan.org, info@pdplan.org. Our book is called the Parkinson's Plan. It's available on Amazon or your library or wherever you'd like to get your books. There are people making their voices heard. I'll give you two examples. Congressman Gus Bilirakis, Republican from Florida, brother died of Parkinson's, father has Parkinson's, leads the Congressional Caucus on Parkinson's, was the chief House sponsor of the National Plan to End Parkinson's Act, which passed the U.S. House 407-9, unanimously passed the Senate, signed into law by President Biden, and just had its advisory council put into place. He's been a champion of Parkinson's disease for 20 plus years. On the Democratic side, Senator Cory Booker, father had died from Parkinson's disease, has been working tirelessly to reduce exposure to pesticides and tighten pesticide regulations out there. In the end, this is a political issue, and people have political power. People with Parkinson's disease and their spouse account for 1% of the U.S. electorate. People with Alzheimer's disease and their spouses account for probably 5% of the electorate. If people make their voices heard, politicians will react. Politicians, by their nature, largely don't lead, but they react. They stay in political power by reacting to the needs of their constituents. Why this isn't a political issue is unclear to me. This is a political issue. We are spending $300 billion as a society on Alzheimer's disease. We're spending another $50 billion on Parkinson's disease. 35 million Americans are in caregiving roles, caring for adults, not for their children, but for adults with debilitating diseases that get worse over time, and their ability to care for these individuals decreases over time because they're getting older themselves, and caregiving adds to stress and worsens health just by the mere act of caregiving. The sooner we recognize that this is a political issue, the sooner that people with Parkinson's disease, the Alzheimer's community, the ALS community, the autism community realize that there are common roots to these neurological diseases, that the indiscriminate use of nerve-damaging chemicals might have consequences not just for insects but for humans too. The sooner we create a world without these diseases. There is nothing natural about 1 in 31 8-year-olds having autism. There is nothing natural about 1 in 3 85-year-olds having Alzheimer's disease. There is nothing natural about Parkinson's being among the world's fastest growing brain diseases. These are all unnatural. The sooner we recognize their unnatural character, the sooner we create a world without them, the sooner we create a world where we can all live long, healthy lives with our brains and independence intact.
Yeah, thank you for sharing, and also thank you for kind of mentioning the caregiving burden on that, because there have been a lot of research studies out around if you're caregiving for a spouse with dementia, your own mortality risk goes up by somewhere between, I think, 35 to 65%. Some studies have suggested that if you're a dementia caregiver, your own risk of dementia goes up somewhere between 300 to 500%. I mean, it's like there's a second and third order, like your point about dominoes. There's a lot of societal impact from this. So, I appreciate you sharing. I think, in just a couple more questions, and then I'd love to kind of jump into a lightning round.
Maybe we got a couple minutes because I.
Oh yeah, okay. How about this?
My phone's going off here. I'm getting.
Sure. No, this is fascinating. This could be like a 6-hour podcast, but I want to be mindful of your time. I think your answers are amazing. Okay, how about lightning round? So
yeah.
Rapid fire. What's one thing everyone should do this week to lower their Parkinson's risk?
If they drink water from a well, 40 million Americans get their water from a well. They should get a carbon filter from their well. They can for their faucet at home. You can get it at the grocery store, or consider a reverse osmosis system, or test your well. But get a carbon filter for your water if you're among the 40 million Americans who get their water from a well.
Awesome. Okay, what is in most people's home right now that they should throw out today?
I don't think people should be poisoning themselves. I think people got a lot of pesticides that are known to damage their nervous system. If you have Alzheimer's disease, if you have Parkinson's disease, you want to protect your remaining nerve cells. Get those neurotoxins, especially certain pesticides, out of your home.
Is coffee actually protective for your brain?
It appears that caffeine is. Most studies have suggested that caffeine might protect nerve cells, especially from damage in Parkinson's disease. So if you like your caffeinated coffee, enjoy it. Recognize that caffeine does have adverse health consequences, including headaches and anxiety.
What is one thing you wish every neurologist in America understood that they currently do not?
Diseases have causes, and our job is to find those causes. When we find those causes, when we do that for stroke, we do that for headache, we do that for people with confusion, we do that for back pain. When you find out the causes, you can prevent, slow, and treat the diseases most effectively. When someone's diagnosed with Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, and ALS, our job as neurologists is to find out what causes the disease so we can counsel the patient, improve their prognosis, and prevent this disease from affecting others.
And then last one, what do you tell a family who just got a Parkinson's diagnosis and feels like there's no hope?
Well, there's hope. I mean, we told you the course is far more modifiable than we let on. There are people who are in physically better shape than Jimmy Choi is an American Ninja Warrior, competed in multiple things with Parkinson's disease. There are lots and lots of people in better shape with Parkinson's disease today than they were before. But my job is to create a world without Parkinson's disease. I'm not only I sometimes say I'm the neurologist to your kids and your grandkids. My job is, and my role, and what I want to do is create a world where your children and grandchildren never have to bear and taste the awful taste of Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, and ALS.
Thank you so much. I mean, I think this was absolutely awesome. I think people are going to find this so helpful, so informative. I think a lot of our caregiving audience, they're going to, I think, walk away with like very practical advice. So, Dr. Ray Dorsey, thank you so much. This was a great treat. I think everybody check out the book, The Parkinson's Plan. I think it's great. There's some great insights. And I think you've totally, even though I've heard you on interviews and I've read your stuff, I think you've really changed still the way I look at the world around, and even what some of the people we're helping are going through. Never going to think about a golf course the same way again. And I think just like there's the idea that Parkinson's, even dementia, like neurological disorders, are preventable. I think that is something that every family needs to hear, because that might create hope of what they can do to reduce their own risk or to help their loved one that's going through it. Yeah, feel free to tell everyone, where can they grab the book, and how can they follow along your work?
Yes, the book is called The Parkinson's Plan, available at wherever bookstores you like, Amazon, and in libraries. If people want to email us and share their stories, we're always looking for it. We're writing another book right now on preventable, arguing that not just Parkinson's, but ALS, dementia with Lewy bodies, Alzheimer's disease are to a great extent preventable. We love to hear stories from listeners. Info@pdplan.org, info@pdplan.org. And my name is Ray Dorsey, and I thank you very, Neal, for all the great work that you're doing. Listen, caregiving is brutal, and people like you are working to make the lives of caregivers better, and they're trying to make the lives of the people that they're caring for better. And what we're trying to do is create a world where people don't have to spend their lives caregiving, and where people don't have to spend their lives suffering from these terrible preventable conditions.
Amen. Amen to that. And I think, so to everyone listening, there you have it. I think if this one hit home for you, do one thing, as Ray mentioned, go to pdplan.org, think about and be intentional about what is in your water, what's in your air. I think just taking a few minutes to think about these issues could change things for you and your loved one. We'll be sharing clips from this conversation across all the platforms, over the next several weeks, like YouTube, Instagram, Facebook, etc. So keep an eye out. And if anything here makes you think of someone you love or a friend, send it their way. If you're not subscribed yet, this is your sign. Please subscribe and follow along. Dr. Ray Dorsey, thank you so much. Truly, I think this was an eye-opening conversation. And to everyone out there listening, thank you for spending time with us. We'll see you in the next one. And let's create a world without neurological disease.
Thank you, Neal.